Chapter 1. The Weight of a Single Leaf. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly quiet. If you're tucked in, the lights are low, and the world outside has finally decided to be still, then you're in the right place. Tonight, we aren't looking at crumbling empires or bloody revolutions. Instead, we're going to drift back to the Tang Dynasty in China, specifically between the 7th and 10th centuries. It was a time of immense sophistication, but more importantly, it was the era when people started taking a simple leaf in hot water way too seriously. So, settle in, adjust your pillow, and let's just float away into the steam of a 1,000-year-old teapot. To understand the Tang obsession with tea, we have to look at Lu Yu. Now, Lu Yu was essentially the world's first tea influencer, minus the ring light and the sponsorship deals. He was an orphan raised by Buddhist monks, which sounds like a very serene start, but he actually ran away to join the circus, or the 8th century equivalent, as a clown. Eventually, he realized that making people laugh was exhausting, and he decided to dedicate his entire existence to the precise, agonizingly specific art of brewing tea. He wrote the Zhejiang, or the Classic of Tea, which is basically a manual for people who find regular water too impulsive. In the Tang Dynasty, they didn't just throw a bag in a mug and microwave it. That would have probably resulted in an immediate exile. Back then, tea came in compressed bricks. Imagine a dusty, hard puck of fermented vegetation that you had to literally grind into a powder. But before you even ground it, you had to toast it over a very specific type of charcoal fire. Lu Yu insisted that if the charcoal wasn't made from the right kind of wood, your tea would taste like disappointment and failure. He had a very, if it's not perfect, why are we even breathing, energy about him. You had to hold the tea cake over the flames until it became soft and toad skin textured. Yes, that was the official descriptor. Because nothing says relaxing beverage quite like the aesthetic of a swamp-dwelling amphibian. Once the tea was toasted and ground into a fine dust, we get to the water. And this is where the Tang Dynasty really doubles down on the pedantry. Lu Yu classified water into different grades. The best water came from the center of a flowing mountain stream. Not the edges are stagnant. Not a waterfall, that's too violent. Just a nice, polite, midstream flow. If you were stuck using well water, you were basically a peasant in his eyes. He famously claimed he could taste the difference between water taken from the middle of the Yangtze River and water taken from the shore. It's the kind of high-maintenance energy we can only aspire to while we're lying here in bed. The boiling process itself was a 3-stage drama. The first boil was when the bubbles looked like fish's eyes, and a tiny bit of salt was added. Why salt? Because why not add a savory twist to your morning caffeine? The second boil was when the bubbles looked like strung pearls at the edge of the pot. This is when you would scoop out a bit of water and stir the center to create a vortex, a tiny liquid tornado, and then gently pour in your tea powder. The third boil was when the water looked like surging billows. If you let it go past that, the water was considered old and ruined. It's comforting, really, to think that while the rest of the world was fighting over territory, Lu Yu was staring at a pot of water, waiting for it to look like a specific type of jewelry. The tea wasn't even a clear liquid like we have today. It was a frothy, bright green soup. They used wide, shallow bowls because the foam, the froth of the liquid jade, was the most important part. They would sit there in their silk robes in a garden that probably cost more than a small city and discuss the 5 colors of the tea. It was all very slow, very deliberate, and incredibly unnecessary, which is exactly why it's so perfect for us tonight. There is something deeply soothing about a society that spent decades debating the exact shape of a bubble. As the steam rose from these jade-colored bowls, the Tang elites felt they were achieving a state of harmony. It wasn't about the caffeine hit, it was about the ritual. They had 24 different tools for the tea ceremony. 24. Including a specific brush to clean the steam off the lid. If you forgot your specialized tea towel dryer, you might as well just go back to bed. It was a world of hushed voices and the clinking of porcelain. A world where the most stressful thing that happened all day was realizing your charcoal wasn't quite toad skin enough. Let's leave Lu Yu and his bubbles behind for a moment and drift over to the royal courts, where the tea was even more complicated, because of course it was. The emperors of the Tang Dynasty didn't just want good tea, they wanted tribute tea. This was tea grown on specific mountains, picked by specific people at a specific time of day, usually dawn, before the dew had dried, because apparently midday dew is just too aggressive for a royal palate. The life of a royal tea picker was an exercise in extreme gentleness. They were often told not to eat certain spicy foods or garlic because their breath might offend the tea leaves. Just imagine being a leaf, hanging out on a mountain, and having a human avoid onions just for your sake. It's a level of luxury that borders on the surreal. These leaves were then processed and pressed into cakes stamped with the imperial seal, sometimes dragons, sometimes clouds, and wrapped in silk for the long journey to the capital, Chang'an. When the tea arrived, the emperor wouldn't just drink it. He would host tea competitions. Think of it as a very slow, very quiet version of a modern reality show. Dignitaries and poets would gather to see whose tea had the whitest foam. If your foam dissipated too quickly, you lost. You just had to stand there with your flat tea and your shattered dignity. The poets, of course, loved this. They wrote thousands of verses about the dewy essence and the cloud-like vapor. One poet, Lu Tong, wrote a famous poem called The Seven Bowls of Tea. By the first bowl, his throat was moistened. By the second, his loneliness was gone. By the third, he was searching his withered entrails, which is a bit much for a Tuesday afternoon, but we'll allow it. By the seventh bowl, he claimed he could feel a breeze under his arms and was ready to fly away to the land of the immortals. That's either some very high-quality tea or he really should have stopped at bowl number 4. But that was the Tang vibe. If you weren't feeling a spiritual connection to a shrub, you weren't doing it right. The irony, of course, is that while they were seeking immortality through tea, the dynasty was slowly doing what all dynasties do, overextending itself, getting involved in messy succession crises, and dealing with generals who had far too much ambition. But in the tea rooms, none of that mattered. There was only the sound of the whisk, the warmth of the bowl against the palms, and the knowledge that for at least 10 minutes, everything was exactly as it should be. Even the ceramics were a matter of life and death. You couldn't just use any bowl. The favorite was Yuware, a type of celadone that had a soft, grayish-green glaze. They said it looked like shards of ice or moss-covered stones. It was designed to make the green tea look even greener. If you used a white bowl, the tea looked too dark. If you used a black bowl, you were clearly a rebel or someone with no taste. The aesthetics were the point. It was a shield against the chaos of the world. A very fragile, very expensive shield made of baked clay. So, as we imagine the steam rising from a Yuware bowl in a quiet pavilion over 1,000 years ago, we can see how the Tang Dynasty created a masterpiece of boredom. They took a physiological need, thirst, and turned it into a complex, multi-layered performance that could last for hours. They weren't in a rush. They had nowhere to be. The tea would boil when it boiled, and the bubbles would look like fish's eyes when they were ready. There is a profound lesson in that, if we weren't already too sleepy to care. Chapter 2: The Soft Collapse of the Merovingians. The transition from the meticulous gardens of China to the damp, drafty forests of early medieval France is a bit of a tonal shift, but the levels of dysfunction remain remarkably consistent. The Merovingian kings are often called the long-haired kings, because they believed their royal power lived in their hair. If you cut a Merovingian's hair, he lost his right to rule. It was essentially a kingdom governed by the principles of a high-end hair salon, which is exactly as stable as it sounds. These kings were the descendants of Clovis, and they were, to put it mildly, a mess. While Lu Yu was worrying about the salinity of his tea water, the Merovingians were worrying about which of their brothers was currently trying to stab them in the dark. But because they were sacred, they didn't do a lot of the actual governing. That was left to the mayor of the palace. The kings mostly sat in ox carts, yes, ox carts, not even fancy carriages, and were paraded around to look at things. They were the original participation trophy royalty. The Merovingian family tree is less of a tree and more of a thorny bush that has been set on fire. They had a charming habit of naming everyone the same thing. There are so many Chilperics, Childeberts, and Clothars that even the contemporary historians gave up trying to keep them straight. It's like a sitcom where every character is played by the same actor but with a slightly different hat. This made succession crises inevitable. Every time a king died, his sons would divide the kingdom like a pizza, and then immediately start fighting over who got the piece with the most pepperoni. One of the most famously disastrous periods involved two queens, Fredegund and Brunhilde. Their rivalry lasted for decades and involved an impressive amount of creative assassination. It started when Fredegund, who was a palace servant, convinced King Chilperic to strangle his wife, Galswintha, who happened to be Brunhilde's sister. Brunhilde was, understandably, a bit annoyed by this. What followed was a 40-year cycle of, "You killed my husband, so I'll poison your son, so you'll hire a monk to stab my nephew." Fredegund was particularly inventive. She once sent two clerics with poison daggers to kill a rival, telling them that if they died in the attempt, she would provide for their families. It was like a very dark, very low-budget version of a corporate benefits package. She managed to die in her bed, which, considering her hobby was murder, is the ultimate historical irony. Brunhilde was not so lucky. At the age of 80, she was captured by Fredegund's son, Clothar II, who accused her of killing 10 kings. He had her lashed to the tail of a wild horse and, well, it wasn't a peaceful retirement. But even amidst this constant, low-stakes carnage, the Merovingians were surprisingly lazy. As the years went on, they became the do-nothing kings, Royce Faineants. They stayed in their villas, let their hair grow to their waists, and occasionally popped out to sign a document they hadn't read. They were the ultimate figureheads, drifting through history in a haze of royal apathy. They were wealthy, they were sacred, and they were completely irrelevant. There's a certain peacefulness to their decline. The world was moving on around them. The mayors of the palace, particularly the ancestors of Charlemagne, were doing the heavy lifting, organizing armies, collecting taxes, and making sure the borders didn't collapse. The Merovingians just stayed in the background, like a piece of antique furniture that everyone is too polite to throw away. They were a dynasty in a slow-motion fall, draped in fine linen and smelling of expensive hair oils. By the time the last Merovingian, Childeric III, was finally deposed in 751, he didn't even put up a fight. The Pope gave permission to the Carolingians to take the throne, arguing that the person who actually does the work of a king should be the king. A radical concept, truly. They cut Childeric's long hair, the ultimate indignity, and sent him to a monastery. He probably found the monastery quite relaxing, honestly. No one was trying to poison his wine, and he didn't have to ride in an ox cart anymore. The Merovingians represent that specific type of royal tragedy where the family is so old and so pure that they simply stop functioning. They become decorative. Like the Tang tea bowls, they were beautiful, fragile, and ultimately not very good at handling the rough reality of the world. We can almost see them now, sitting in a sun-drenched courtyard, their long hair catching the light, completely unaware that their entire world is about to be cut short by a pair of scissors. Chapter 3: The Evolutionary Cul-de-sac of the Spanish Habsburgs. If the Merovingians were a lesson in what happens when you let your hair get too long, the Spanish Habsburgs are a masterclass in what happens when you refuse to date anyone who doesn't share your last name. We're drifting now into the 16th and 17th centuries, moving from the sunny tea pavilions of China to the gloomy, incense-choked halls of the Alcazar in Madrid. This was a place where the air was thick with religious fervor and the genetic consequences of centuries of keeping it in the family. The Habsburgs were essentially a collection of chins in search of a kingdom. Because of a very specific, very stubborn jawline that became the family's most famous heirloom, they were unmistakable. It was called the Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, and it wasn't just a minor cosmetic quirk. It was a statement. By the time we get to Philip IV, the jaw was so pronounced that he allegedly couldn't chew his food properly. But Philip IV didn't mind much. He was too busy being depressed and painting his own face. Philip IV is the patron saint of the slow, sad sigh. He ruled for 44 years, and for most of that time, he looked like he was about to burst into tears. He was a man of immense culture. He was the patron of Velázquez after all, but he had the emotional constitution of a damp napkin. He spent his days in a state of perpetual melancholy, wandering through his massive palace, surrounded by jesters and dwarves, who were often the only people allowed to speak to him honestly. The Spanish court was governed by a system of etiquette so rigid it felt like a slow-motion play. Everything was choreographed. There was a specific way to sit, a specific way to eat, and a specific way to enter a room. If the king was thirsty, a servant would hand a glass to a nobleman, who would hand it to a higher-ranking nobleman, who would finally present it to the king. By the time the water reached his lips, it was probably lukewarm and dusty, but at least the social hierarchy was preserved. It was the Tang tea ceremony, but with more velvet and significantly more existential dread. But the real star of our bedtime story isn't Philip, it's his son, Charles II. Now, Charles II is often described as the most unfortunate monarch in history, which is a polite way of saying he was a biological disaster. Because his parents were uncle and niece, and their parents were also related, and their parents' parents were also related. Charles's genetic code was essentially a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. He had a coefficient of inbreeding higher than if his parents had been siblings. Charles was born in 1661, and the entire Spanish Empire held its breath. He didn't speak until he was 4. He didn't walk until he was 8. He was frequently ill, suffering from everything from digestive issues to what the court doctors called the melancholy of the blood. His jaw was so large and his tongue so oversized that he could barely be understood when he spoke. He drooled constantly, and yet, because he was the king, everyone had to pretend he was a divine being. The daily life of Charles II was a long, slow crawl through a haze of superstition and ineffective medicine. To cure his various ailments, the court physicians tried everything. They placed warm pigeons on his head to draw out the vapors. They gave him potions made of crushed emeralds. At one point, they even convinced him that he was bewitched, leading to the famous exorcism of the king. They brought in friars to cast out demons that were supposedly living in his stomach. Imagine being Charles, sickly, tired, and just wanting a nap, and having a group of men in robes shouting at your belly buttons. It's not exactly the recipe for a restful afternoon. Despite all this, Charles lived to be 38. His reign was a period of peaceful stagnation. Since the king couldn't really focus on things like governing or war, the empire just sort of sat there. The bureaucracy kept grinding along, the silver kept coming in from the Americas, though in smaller amounts, and the Spanish nobles spent their time arguing over who got to hold the king's candle during Massachusetts. It was a kingdom in a coma, draped in black lace and smelling of old candle wax. When Charles finally died in 1700, the autopsy, which was recorded with gruesome, almost poetic detail, noted that his body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, and his head was full of water. Whether or not that's medically accurate doesn't really matter. It perfectly captures the vibe of his life. He was a candle that had been flickering in a drafty hallway for decades, and finally, mercifully, the flame went out. The end of the Spanish Habsburgs was a quiet affair. There were no grand battles to mark their exit, just a very long, very complicated will that sparked a massive European war, but that's far too exciting for our purposes tonight. What matters is the stillness of the Escorial, the massive, cold stone palace where the Habsburgs were buried. They were placed in tiny marble cubbyholes, stacked on top of each other, finally achieving the perfect, unmoving order they had tried so hard to maintain in life. Let's float away from the gloomy Escorial and move toward the French countryside, where the air is a bit fresher, though the people are no less strange. We're heading toward the court of Louis XIV, but not the version you see in the history books, the one with the wars and the glory. We're interested in the version where everyone is obsessed with their own bowel movements and the exact height of their wig. Chapter 4. The Clockwork Court of the Sun King. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was the man who decided that the best way to control the nobility was to force them to watch him get dressed every morning. This was the levee, and it was a masterpiece of tedious ritual. Hundreds of people would cram into the king's bedroom just to watch him put on his breeches. There was a specific person whose entire job was to hold the right sleeve of his shirt. Another person held the left. If you were the guy who got to hand him his handkerchief, you were a superstar. The Palace of Versailles was essentially a giant, gold-plated gilded cage. Louis moved the entire government there because he wanted to keep an eye on everyone. If a nobleman wasn't at Versailles, he wasn't seen. And if he wasn't seen, he didn't exist. So, the most powerful men in France spent their days standing in hallways, hoping the king would nod at them as he walked to the chapel. It was a life of high-stakes loitering. But beneath the gold leaf and the silk, Versailles was a bit of a mess. For one thing, there weren't enough bathrooms. Not even close. People would frequently just use the corners of the hallways or the space behind a curtain. The smell was famously appalling. One visitor remarked that the palace was a magnificent pile of filth. Imagine the most beautiful building you've ever seen, but it smells like a New York subway station in August. That was the reality of the Sun King's court. Louis himself was a man of extreme habits. He ate massive amounts of food. His autopsy later revealed he had a stomach twice the size of a normal human's, and he insisted on a very specific schedule. With an almanac and a watch, one courtier said, one could tell from 300 leagues away exactly what the king was doing. He was a human clock. He woke at 8 o'clock, ate at 1 o'clock, walked in the gardens at 2 o'clock, and went to bed at 11:30. Single. The gardens were his true passion. He spent millions of livres moving entire forests and creating fountains that only worked when he was walking past them. There was a team of whistleblowers stationed throughout the gardens. When they saw the king approaching, they would whistle to the fountain operators to turn on the water. Once he passed, they'd whistle again to turn it off to save water. It was a literal theater of nature, where even the water had to perform on cue. Life at Versailles was a constant struggle against boredom. To pass the time, the nobles gambled for insane amounts of money. They would sit at card tables for 12 hours straight, losing entire estates in a single night, all while maintaining a look of complete indifference. If you showed emotion, you were common. You had to be a man of perfect, boring composure. The wigs, of course, were the peak of this absurdity. They were huge, heavy, and filled with powder and animal fat. They were also prone to infestations of lice and, occasionally, small rodents. There are stories of ladies in waiting having to sleep with mouse traps near their hair to keep the critters away. But you couldn't just take the wig off. To be seen without your wig was like being seen without your skin. As we imagine the Sun King sitting in his golden chair, surrounded by hundreds of people who are all pretending they don't smell the hallways or feel the lice in their wigs, we can see the sheer, exhausting effort of being grand. It was a world where everything was a performance, and the audience was always watching. But as the sun sets over the fountains of Versailles, and the whistleblowers go home for the night, the palace finally falls quiet. The gold leaf glitters in the moonlight, and for a few hours, the magnificent pile of filth is just a silent, lonely house. Chapter 5. The Byzantine art of doing absolutely nothing. While Louis XIV was busy turning himself into a human clock, the Byzantine Empire had already spent 1,000 years perfecting the art of being impossibly complicated and incredibly still. If you were a member of the elite in Constantinople, your life wasn't measured in achievements, but in the number of layers of silk you were allowed to wear and how many people were required to bow when you sneezed. It was a civilization that lived in a perpetual state of "it's complicated." The Great Palace of Constantinople was a sprawling labyrinth of gold-tiled halls, hidden passageways, and gardens that smelled of jasmine and ancient bureaucracy. To be an emperor here was to be less of a man and more of a living icon. One of the most famous emperors, Theophilos, had a throne room that was basically a 9th century version of a theme park. It featured golden lions that would mechanically roar and golden birds that would sing in the branches of a golden tree. When a visitor approached, the throne itself would slowly rise into the air, leaving the emperor hovering above the ground like a bored god. It was meant to be intimidating, but mostly it just meant the emperor had to sit very still while a series of pulleys and gears groaned underneath him. The court of the Byzantines was obsessed with taxis, which translates to order. Everything had its place. There was a book called the De Ceremoniis, written by Emperor Constantine VII, which is essentially a 500-page manual on how to stand still and look expensive. It detailed the exact number of steps an official must take, what color of boots they should wear on a Tuesday, and the precise moment they were allowed to sit down. If you stepped with your left foot when the manual required your right, the social fallout was catastrophic. It was a culture of high-stakes liturgical theater, where the actors were often too exhausted by the weight of their own robes to actually do any governing. This obsession with ritual extended to the point of absurdity during the reigns of the porphyrogeniti, the born in the purple. These were children born in a specific room in the palace lined with purple marble. They were considered so sacred that they were barely allowed to touch the floor. One can imagine a young prince, draped in heavy brocade, staring out a window at the Bosporus, wondering why he has to spend 4 hours watching a group of eunuchs debate the theological implications of a particular type of incense. Speaking of eunuchs, they were the backbone of the Byzantine state. Because they couldn't start their own dynasties, they were considered safe by the emperors. They ran the treasury, the kitchens, and the secret police. They were the ultimate middle managers of the medieval world. They lived in a world of hushed whispers and soft slippers, moving through the palace like ghosts. Their existence was a testament to the Byzantine belief that the best way to prevent trouble was to make sure everyone involved was as physically and socially limited as possible. The fashion of the Byzantine elite was designed to minimize movement. The garments were so stiff with gold embroidery and pearls that you couldn't really bend your arms. You just sort of drifted through the halls like a very ornate, very slow-moving pillar. And because the empire was so old, they were constantly looking backward. They spoke a version of Greek that was hundreds of years out of date, making every conversation sound like a lecture at a dusty university. They were a people living in a museum of their own making. One of the more eccentric figures was Empress Zoe, who ruled in the 11th century. Zoe wasn't interested in the tedious work of statecraft. She was obsessed with cosmetics. She turned her private apartments in the palace into a laboratory for perfumes and ointments. While the borders were being threatened by the Normans and the Turks, Zoe was surrounded by boiling pots of exotic oils and rare herbs, trying to find the secret to eternal youth. The palace supposedly smelled like a giant potpourri bowl. She was also famously married 3 times, each time to a man who was progressively more exhausted by her hobby of turning the imperial treasury into a giant Sephora. Then there were the stylites, holy men who decided that the best way to be closer to God was to sit on top of a very tall pillar for decades. They weren't exactly royals, but the royals were obsessed with them. Emperors would send messengers to the top of these pillars to ask for advice on tax policy. Imagine being a messenger, climbing a 30-foot ladder to find a man who hasn't moved in 20 years and smells like a goat, just to ask him if you should devalue the currency. It's the kind of slow-motion madness that only the Byzantine world could produce. As the centuries wore on, the empire became smaller and smaller, but the ceremonies became even more elaborate. It was as if by maintaining the taxis, the order, they could pretend that the walls weren't crumbling. In the final years, the Emperor of the Romans ruled over little more than a few neighborhoods and a lot of tradition. But they still had the golden birds, and the lions still roared, even if the gears were a bit rusty, and the silk was still purple. There is something deeply relaxing about a civilization that refuses to change its outfit for 1,000 years. It's a reminder that even as the world changes, some people will always prioritize the exact shade of their boots over the collapse of their borders. As we leave the shimmering gold of Constantinople, we can hear the faint sound of the mechanical birds, chirping away in an empty room, a soft, metallic lullaby for a dying empire. Chapter 6: The Melancholy Gardeners of the Mughal Empire. Now, let's travel east, toward the humid, spice-scented air of India during the reign of the Mughals. While the Byzantines were obsessed with pillars, the Mughals were obsessed with gardens. But not just any gardens, they wanted charbagh, or the 4-part garden, symbolizing the gardens of paradise. These were places of absolute symmetry, where water flowed in perfectly straight lines and every tree was planted to mirror its neighbor. The Mughal emperors, despite their reputation as fierce conquerors, were surprisingly sensitive souls who spent a lot of time writing poetry and worrying about their health. Take Jahangir, for example. He was the 4th Mughal emperor, and he was a man of intense contradictions. He was a ruthless ruler, but he also had a deep love for nature. He kept a diary where he recorded the most mundane details of his life, like the time he saw a particularly interesting goat or the exact weight of a large radish. He was the 17th century version of someone who takes photos of every meal they eat. Jahangir's daily life was a slow, hazy progression of luxury. He was a fan of wine and opium, which he consumed in precise amounts while sitting in his gardens. He would spend hours watching his court painters depict a single flower. He once commissioned a painting of a turkey, a bird he had never seen before, and spent days analyzing its feathers. There's something very calming about an emperor who has an entire subcontinent to rule but decides to spend his afternoons staring at a turkey's neck. His wife, Nur Jahan, was the one who actually ran the empire. While Jahangir was in his opium-induced Zen state, Nur Jahan was issuing coins, designing buildings, and winning battles. She was a master of the soft power of the court. She designed the tomb of the white marble for her father, which became the blueprint for the Taj Mahal. She understood that in the Mughal world, architecture was the ultimate way to stay relevant. If you built a big enough garden, people would have to remember you. The Mughal court was a place of extreme sensory detail. They had kushkana, or cooling houses, where the walls were lined with wet grass to keep the air cool during the blistering summers. They had servants whose only job was to fan the emperor with peacock feathers. The air was constantly perfumed with rose water and sandalwood. It was a life of soft edges. Everything was cushioned, scented, and designed to be as effortless as possible. But even in this paradise, there was a sense of lingering sadness. The emperors were constantly haunted by the fear of their sons rebelling. In the Mughal tradition, there was no firstborn gets everything rule. It was takht ya takhta, the throne or the coffin. Every time an emperor got a cold, his sons would start polishing their swords. It created a strange atmosphere of relaxing while looking over your shoulder. You're sitting in a garden, listening to the water, but you're also wondering if the guy bringing you your mango is working for your youngest brother. The most tragic of the Mughals was perhaps Dara Shirkoh, the eldest son of Shah Jahan. Dar was a philosopher and a mystic. He translated the Upanishads into Persian and dreamed of a world where all religions lived in harmony. He spent his time in libraries and gardens, discussing the nature of the soul. He was the ultimate sleepy historian prince. Unfortunately, his younger brother was Aurangzeb, who was not a mystic, did not like gardens, and was very good at war. The story of the Mughals is a story of beautiful, fragile things being crushed by the weight of reality. But for a few decades under Jahangir and Shah Jahan, the empire was a masterpiece of aesthetic boredom. They created a world of white marble and flowing water, where the most important task of the day was deciding which variety of mango was the most superior. As we drift off, we can imagine the scent of the rose water in the cooling house, the soft rustle of the peacock fans, and the slow, rhythmic sound of the water channels in the charbagh. The Mughals knew that life was fleeting, so they built their paradise in stone and silk, hoping that the symmetry would protect them from the chaos outside. Chapter 7. The Clockmaker King and the Quiet End of Versailles. While we've spent a lot of time in the sun-drenched gardens of India and the golden halls of Byzantium, we now return to France, but a France that is much quieter and far more awkward. We are looking at Louis XVI, the grandson of the Sun King, who inherited a world of absolute splendor and had absolutely no idea what to do with it. If Louis XIV was a lion, Louis XVI was a very gentle, very confused golden retriever lost in a palace. Louis XVI was a man of simple, almost aggressively boring tastes. While his wife, Marie Antoinette, was famously busy being the 18th century version of a fashion icon, building a fake peasant village so she could pretend to milk very clean cows, Louis just wanted to be left alone in his workshop. He was obsessed with two things: locks and clocks. He had a private room at the top of Versailles where he would spend hours filing metal, turning gears, and trying to understand the mechanical soul of a timepiece. There is something deeply peaceful about a king who, when faced with a national debt crisis, decides that what the world really needs is a more efficient deadbolt. His daily routine was a shadow of the Sun King's. He still had to go through the public ceremonies, but he did so with the air of a man who was counting the minutes until he could go back to his tools. He was short-sighted, a bit portly and famously shy. During the Grand Couvert, where the royal family ate in front of the public, Louis would often just sit there and eat massive amounts of mutton in total silence, avoiding eye contact with everyone. It wasn't that he was being rude, he was just socially exhausted by the sheer act of existing as a monarch. The tragedy of Louis XVI was that he was a good man in a bad job. He genuinely wanted his people to like him, but he lacked the vibe of authority. He would wander the halls of Versailles, often bumping into people because he wasn't wearing his glasses, looking less like the ruler of the most powerful nation in Europe and more like a distracted professor looking for his keys. He loved maps, he loved geography, and he loved the idea of order, but only the kind of order he could control with a screwdriver. As the revolution began to simmer outside the palace gates, the life inside Versailles became even more surreal. The court etiquette continued, but it felt hollow. They were still debating who was allowed to hold the king's candle, while miles away, people were debating how to dismantle the monarchy. Louis, ever the optimist of the mundane, seemed to believe that if he just stayed quiet and worked on his locks, the world would eventually settle down. There is a famous entry in his diary on July 14, 1789, the day the Bastille was stormed. He wrote a single word, rain. Nothing. To be fair, he was referring to his hunting bag. He hadn't caught any deer that day. But it has become the ultimate symbol of his reign. A man so focused on the small, mechanical details of his life that he completely missed the collapse of his universe. It's a very sleepy way to lose a kingdom. Chapter 8. The Hermit of the Forbidden City. Let's float across the world one last time, back to China, but to a very different era than the Tang Dynasty we started with. We are now in the early 20th century, inside the Forbidden City in Beijing. This was a world that had remained unchanged for 500 years, a city within a city where the emperor was the son of heaven, and commoners were forbidden from even looking at the walls. The last emperor, Puyi, became the ruler of nearly a quarter of the world's population when he was just nearly 3 years old. Imagine a toddler being carried into a vast, cold hall of yellow silk and incense, where thousands of grown men are prostrating themselves on the ground. For Puyi, this wasn't power, it was a prison. He spent his childhood surrounded by thousands of eunuchs who were paid to agree with him. If he wanted to eat candy for breakfast, he ate candy. If he wanted to beat a servant, he was told it was his divine right. He was the most spoiled and the most lonely child in history. The life of the last emperor was a series of endless, hollow rituals. He was dressed in layers of heavy silk that he wasn't allowed to get dirty. His meals were tasted by an army of officials to ensure they weren't poisoned, meaning his food was always cold by the time it reached him. He lived in a world where time didn't exist in the modern sense. There were no appointments, only traditions. He would spend his days playing with his pet crickets or wandering through the rock gardens, followed by a silent procession of attendants. The Forbidden City was a masterpiece of stagnation. While the rest of the world was inventing cars, airplanes, and cinema, the court in Beijing was still debating the proper way to kowtow. Puyi eventually got a bicycle and a pair of glasses, symbols of the modern world that felt like alien artifacts in the Ming-era palace. He even had his queue, the long braid of hair required by Manchu law, cut off. It was his version of the Merovingian hair cutting, a sign that the old world was finally, quietly, fading away. In 1912, the Republic was declared, and Puyi was forced to abdicate. But in a move that feels very sleepy historian, they allowed him to keep living in the Forbidden City for another 12 years. He was a king without a kingdom, an emperor of a few courtyards. He lived in a bubble of pretend power, while the world outside the red walls changed forever. He would host tennis matches in the ancient courtyards, the sound of the ball hitting the racket echoing off walls that had once seen the height of imperial glory. Eventually, he was kicked out of the palace entirely and ended his life as a simple gardener in Beijing. He reportedly enjoyed the quiet work of tending to plants, a far cry from being the son of heaven, but perhaps much closer to the peace he had been looking for all along. He had traded a golden cage for a small garden, and in the end, that was enough. Chapter 9. The Reclusive Clockwork of the Japanese Shogunate. As we leave the gardens of Beijing, we drift across the sea to Japan, specifically to the Edo period. This was a time when the entire country was essentially put into a state of intentional, state-mandated boredom. For over 250 years, the Tokugawa shogunate decided that the best way to keep the peace was to make sure absolutely nothing happened. They closed the borders, banned travel, and created a social hierarchy so rigid that your life was essentially a pre-written script from the moment you were born until the moment you were tucked into a quiet grave. At the center of this stillness was the shogun, living in Edo Castle. While the emperor was the spiritual figurehead in Kyoto, living a life of poetry and incredibly slow tea ceremonies, the shogun was the one who actually sat at the desk. But even for the shogun, life was a series of endless, repetitive rituals. The Tokugawa family was obsessed with Sankinkotai, or the system of alternate attendance. This required every regional lord, or daimyo, to spend every other year in Edo. Imagine the sheer rhythmic monotony of this. Every year, thousands of samurai would march hundreds of miles in perfect silence, carrying heavy trunks of silk and lacquerware just to sit in a house in Edo for 12 months before marching back. It was a massive, expensive exercise in walking. There were specific rules about how many followers you could have, what color your umbrella could be, and how many times you had to bow to the shogun's gate. It was the ultimate busy work for the warrior class. Since there were no wars to fight, the samurai, men trained for centuries in the art of the sword, spent their time practicing calligraphy, debating the nuances of incense, and worrying about the correct way to fold a letter. The shoguns themselves often retreated into highly specific, almost meditative hobbies. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the founder of the dynasty, was obsessed with medicinal herbs. He spent his retirement grinding roots and berries into pastes, essentially becoming a royal pharmacist. Later shoguns took up the study of Dutch learning, which meant they spent years staring at a single European telescope or a clock, trying to understand a world they had officially forbidden themselves from entering. One of the most charmingly boring aspects of this era was the development of karakuri, mechanical dolls. These were wind-up automatons made of wood and whalebone. One famous doll would walk across a tatami mat to serve a cup of tea. Once the guest took the cup, the doll would stop. When the empty cup was placed back on the tray, the doll would turn around and walk back to its starting position. It was a masterpiece of engineering used for the most low-stakes task imaginable. People would sit for hours, in total silence, watching a wooden doll serve tea. It was the peak of Edo period entertainment. The cities themselves were governed by town codes that regulated everything. There were laws about what kind of fabric you could wear based on your income, and even laws about how much you could spend on a wedding gift. If you were a merchant who got too wealthy, the shogunate might suggest you donate your fortune to the state, just to keep the social balance properly dull. It was a world where ambition was considered a personality flaw and stability was the only true virtue. As the sun sets over the tiled roofs of Edo, and the sound of the evening bell echoes through the quiet streets, we can feel the weight of those 200 years of peace. It was a long, slow nap for a whole nation. There were no grand conquests, no revolutionary breakthroughs, just the steady tick of a clockwork doll and the smell of drying ink on a scroll. Chapter 10. The damp, scholarly silence of the Oxford dawn. To finish our long journey through the history of the unhurried, we move away from palaces and toward the ivory towers of 19th century Oxford. This was a world of perpetual afternoon. The Victorian Oxford dons were a unique species of human, often more interested in the precise translation of a single Greek particle than in the fact that the British Empire was currently covering half the globe. A typical don't life was a series of very small, very quiet movements. He would wake in a drafty room, eat a breakfast of cold toast and marmalade, and then retreat to a library that smelled of leather and decay. He might spend 40 years working on a dictionary of a language that only 3 people spoke. He wasn't in a rush. He had a life fellowship, which meant as long as he didn't get married, until the rules changed, and didn't burn down the chapel, he was set for life. The most famous of these was perhaps Lewis Carroll, or Charles Dodgson, as he was known to the university. He was a mathematician who hated change and was terrified of social interaction. He spent his days writing logic puzzles and taking photographs in the soft, gray light of the cloisters. His life was a masterpiece of Victorian structure. He kept a letter register where he recorded every single letter he sent or received for 37 years. He ended up with nearly 100,000 entries. Imagine the calm, rhythmic scratch of the pen, day after day, recording the arrival of a bill for coal or an invitation to tea. The Oxford of this era was a place where tradition was used as a blanket against the cold. They dined in High Hall, where the seating arrangement was as strict as the Byzantine court. They spoke in hushed tones about things that happened 2,000 years ago as if they were yesterday's news. It was a life lived in the margins of books, away from the smoke of the Industrial Revolution and the noise of the modern world. There is a story of an Oxford don who was asked what he did during the great social upheavals of the 1840s. He reportedly thought for a moment and said, "I believe I finished my commentary on the Book of Job." That is the energy we are aiming for tonight. The world can be falling apart, but the commentary must be finished. The tea must be brewed. The lock must be filed. As the fog rolls in from the Thames and settles over the spires of the university, the libraries go dark. The last scholar closes his book, blows out his candle, and climbs into a bed that is probably a bit too firm but feels exactly right. The long-haired kings, the tea-obsessed emperors, the clock-making monarchs, and the butterfly-collecting princes are all finally still. Chapter 11. The Dust and Ink of the Great Library of Alexandria. Leaving the damp cloisters of Oxford, we drift back across the Mediterranean, following the currents of time to a place that has become a legend of lost knowledge, but in reality was likely just a very large, very quiet building filled with people shushing each other. The Great Library of Alexandria wasn't just a repository of books, it was a sanctuary for the world's most dedicated procrastinators and pedants. The library was part of the museum, the Shrine of the Muses, and it was funded by the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt. These kings were Greeks living in Africa who decided that the best way to prove they were the smartest people in the room was to own every piece of papyrus ever written. They were so aggressive about it that they had a policy of searching every ship that docked in Alexandria. If they found a scroll, they would take it, copy it, keep the original, and give the copy back. It was essentially a government-mandated borrowing scheme that would have made a modern librarian weep with envy. The life of a scholar in Alexandria was a dream of quietude. They were given free meals, a salary, and total tax exemption. Also, they could spend their days debating the exact placement of an accent in a Homeric poem. One can imagine a scholar named Xenodotus waking up, having a light breakfast of figs and bread, and then walking through the colonnaded halls to spend 8 hours deciding if a particular line in the Iliad was authentic or not. He wasn't building empires or fighting wars, he was alphabetizing. In fact, Xenodotus is credited with being one of the first people to use alphabetical order. Imagine the thrill of the day he realized that alpha should come before beta. It was a slow-motion revolution in organization. The library itself was a labyrinth of bibliothecae, pigeonholes or shelves, where thousands upon thousands of scrolls were tucked away. Each scroll was wrapped in linen and had a small tag hanging off the end, like a tea bag, telling you what was inside. The air would have smelled of dry papyrus, cedar oil, used to keep away the bugs, and the faint, sweet scent of the nearby harbor. It was a place where the loudest sound was the rustle of a reed mat or the occasional sigh of a man who had just realized his favorite scroll had been misfiled under agriculture instead of astronomy. The scholars weren't just reading, they were correcting. Since every book had to be hand-copied, errors crept in like weeds in a garden. A scholar's entire career could be built on finding a typo in a 300-year-old manuscript. They were the original, well, actually, guys of history. They lived in a world of scholia, tiny, cramped notes written in the margins of texts. Sometimes the notes were longer than the books themselves. They were building a fortress of footnotes to protect themselves from the chaos of the outside world. There was a certain irony to their lives. Outside the library, Alexandria was a bustling, chaotic metropolis, the New York City of the ancient world. It was loud, it was smelly, and it was full of people arguing over the price of grain. But inside the library, time stood still. The Ptolemaic kings might be murdering each other in the palace next door, which happened with alarming frequency, But in the scrolls, Achilles was always sulking in his tent, and the stars were always moving in their perfect, crystalline spheres. As the centuries passed, the library didn't vanish in one great, dramatic fire as the movies like to tell us. It was a much slower, much more sleepless historian kind of end. The funding was cut. The tax exemptions were taken away. The roofs started to leak. Scholars began to leave for quieter cities where the rent was cheaper and the scrolls were less dusty. It was a long, slow evaporation of knowledge. The books weren't always burned. Often, they were simply forgotten, left in dark corners until the damp and the insects turned them back into dust. By the time the final remnants of the library disappeared, the world had moved on. But the spirit of the Alexandrian scholar lives on in every person who finds comfort in a well-organized bookshelf or the smell of an old book. It's the comfort of knowing that even if we can't understand the whole universe, we can at least put the books about it in the right order. As we drift away from the dusty shelves of Alexandria, the scrolls begin to blur into the shadows. The sound of the Mediterranean waves against the harbor wall becomes a rhythmic pulse, a heartbeat for a city that has finally stopped talking. The scholars have all gone home, the ink has dried on the last margin note, and the great silence of the past has returned to claim its own. Chapter 12. The Desert Anchorites and the Luxury of Silence. We leave the dusty shelves of Alexandria and travel south, deep into the Seats desert of Egypt, where the silence wasn't just a byproduct of study, but a professional requirement. In the 4th and 5th centuries, a group of people known as the Desert Fathers and Mothers decided that the Roman Empire was simply too loud. They didn't want the theater, they didn't want the baths, and they certainly didn't want the politics. So, they walked into the sand, found a cave or a small stone hut, and proceeded to do absolutely nothing for 40 years. These were the anchorites. The word comes from the Greek anachorio, meaning to withdraw. And they were very, very good at it. Imagine a life where your biggest social event of the week is seeing a lizard crawl across a sun-baked rock. There was a monk named Abba Arsenius who was a highly educated former tutor to the Roman emperors. He eventually got so tired of the imperial court's chatter that he fled to the desert and refused to speak to anyone. When people came to ask for his wisdom, he would just stare at the horizon until they felt awkward and left. He was the pioneer of the "this meeting could have been an email" philosophy, but without the email. The daily routine of a desert monk was a masterclass in rhythmic monotony. They woke up before dawn, when the air was still cool and smelled of dry earth, to recite psalms. Then, they spent the entire day weaving baskets. Why baskets? Because it required just enough focus to keep the mind from wandering, but not enough to be actually stimulating. They would sit for 12 hours, their fingers moving in a repetitive, hypnotic loop, turning palm fronds into containers that they would eventually sell or trade for a bit of bread. It was the 4th century version of a fidget spinner, but it lasted for a lifetime. Their diet was equally unexciting. Most lived on paximatia, which was a twice-baked bread that was so hard it had to be soaked in water before it was edible. One monk was famous for eating only 5 olives a day. Another would only eat what a passing crow dropped for him. It was a life of aggressive simplicity. They believed that if you stripped away everything, flavor, noise, comfort, you would eventually find a deep, unshakable peace. Or at the very least, you'd get very good at identifying different types of sand. There is a gentle irony in their pursuit of solitude. Because they were so famously unfindable, thousands of people started trekking into the desert to find them. It became a bit of a tourist attraction. You'd have a monk who hadn't spoken in a decade, and suddenly there's a line of pilgrims outside his cave asking for life advice. They would ask things like, "Abba, what is the secret to life?" And the monk would usually say something like, "Go sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." It's the ultimate low-energy advice. They weren't interested in being gurus. They just wanted to finish their baskets. The architecture of their lives was as flat as the landscape. Their cells were small, windowless boxes made of mud brick. No furniture, no books, no decorations. Just a mat for sleeping and a pot for water. In the heat of the afternoon, when the sun turned the desert into a shimmering white haze, the monks would enter a state called hesychia, inner stillness. It was a silence so heavy it felt like a physical blanket. For them, the void wasn't scary, it was a luxury. As the sun sets over the dunes, casting long, purple shadows across the sand, the monks would stop their weaving. The wind would whistle through the cracks in the stones, the only sound in a world that had forgotten the existence of cities and crowns. They lived in a time outside of time, where the rise and fall of empires was just a distant rumor, less important than the quality of a palm frond. We can imagine them now, sitting in the cooling twilight, their hands finally still. The desert air is crisp and silent, and the stars are beginning to appear, one by one, over the vast, empty horizon. It is a world without clocks, without mirrors, and without noise, a perfect, sandy lullaby for the weary soul. Chapter 13: The Clockwork Empire of Rudolf II. Leaving the silent, sandy cells of the desert, we drift north toward the heart of Europe, specifically to the city of Prague in the late 16th century. This was the seat of the Holy Roman Empire under Rudolf II. Now, Rudolf was a man who took the concept of doing your job and replaced it entirely with collecting things that look cool. He was perhaps the most successfully reclusive monarch in history, a man who treated his empire like a noisy neighbor he was trying to ignore. Rudolf lived in the Hradčany castle, perched high above the Vltava River. While the rest of Europe was tearing itself apart over religious wars and power struggles, Rudolf was in his rooms, staring at a very complicated mechanical bird. He was obsessed with the Wunderkammer, or Cabinet of Curiosities. His collection was a sprawling, dusty, and incredibly expensive museum of the weird. He had jars of preserved basilisks, which were probably just dried rays, teeth from giants, and a nail from Noah's Arkansas. He also had the largest collection of clocks and automatons in the world. The life of Rudolf II was a slow, melancholic crawl through a palace filled with ticking. He hated the business of ruling. Ambassadors would travel for months across dangerous borders to see him, only to be told the emperor was busy looking at a new shipment of rare tulips or discussing the properties of mercury with an alchemist. If you wanted to get a message to Rudolf, you had to be prepared to wait, sometimes for years. He lived in a state of profound hesitation, refusing to sign treaties because he wasn't sure if the ink was the right shade of black for the current astrological alignment. Prague became the center of the world for people who were intellectually eccentric. Rudolf invited astronomers like Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler to his court. Tycho was a man who had a golden prosthetic nose because his real one was cut off in a duel over a math equation, and he owned a pet moose that reportedly died after drinking too much beer at a dinner party. This was the level of calmly bizarre that Rudolf cultivated. They would spend their nights on the castle balconies, wrapped in heavy furs, staring at the stars and trying to map the heavens while the emperor sat nearby, playing with a mechanical globe. Rudolf's obsession with the mechanical was a way to make sense of a world that felt increasingly chaotic. He loved clocks that didn't just tell time, but performed tiny plays. There were clocks with moving lions, clocks that played flutes, and clocks that showed the phases of the moon and the movements of the planets. In Rudolf's world, the universe was a giant, silent machine made of brass and silver. If he could just find the right gear, perhaps the empire would stop being so difficult to manage. But as the years passed, Rudolf's reclusiveness turned into a deep, heavy fog of depression. He stopped leaving his rooms entirely. He wouldn't even see his own brothers. He communicated through notes and trusted servants, living in a twilight world of ticking gears and the smell of alchemical sulfur. The court became a ghost town of gold leaf and velvet, where the only thing that moved with any purpose was the pendulum of a clock. When his brother finally deposed him, Rudolf didn't even put up a fight. He just stayed in his castle, surrounded by his basilisks and his mechanical birds, until the end. There is a story that when he died, his favorite pet lion died just a few days later. It was a quiet, strange end to a man who wanted the world to be a library and was disappointed to find it was a battlefield. As we imagine the snow falling over the spires of Prague and the hundreds of clocks in the Hradčany castle ticking in out-of-sync harmony, we can feel the comfort of a life lived entirely inside one's own head. The gears turn, the mechanical birds sing their metallic songs, and the emperor is finally, perfectly undisturbed. Chapter 14. The Slow Pulse of the Victorian Plant Hunters. From the ticking clocks of Prague, we float forward in time to the mid-19th century, a period of frantic industrialization, but we aren't going to the factories. We are going to the damp, quiet greenhouses of Kew Gardens and the remote, misty mountains of China and the Himalayas. This was the era of the plant hunters, men who spent years of their lives in absolute, muddy isolation just to find a slightly different shade of rhododendron. Imagine being a man like David Douglas or Robert Fortune. Your job is to walk. Just walk. You trek through mountain passes where the air is thin and cold, carrying a Wardian case, a heavy, glass and wood box that was essentially a 19th century terrarium. Your entire world is focused on a single, fragile sprout. You have to make sure it doesn't get too much salt spray on the ship, that it doesn't freeze in the mountains, and that no one accidentally eats it. The life of a plant hunter was a masterpiece of monumental patience. They would wait for weeks for a specific flower to bloom so they could identify it. They would spend months learning a local dialect just so they could ask a farmer where a particular type of blue poppy grew. There was no glory in it, usually, just a lot of wet boots and the quiet satisfaction of pressing a leaf between the pages of a leather-bound journal. Back in England, the Victorian elites were obsessed with these finds. But their obsession was also remarkably slow. They would build ferneries, dark, damp, stone rooms filled with ferns, because they believed the sight of a green frond was refreshing to the nervous system. People would spend their entire Sunday afternoons just sitting in a chair, looking at a fern. It was called tridomania, or fern fever. It was the most polite, quietest fever in human history. The plant hunters brought back more than just flowers. They brought back a sense of the infinite variety of the world, but they did it at the speed of a sailing ship. A letter from a collector in Japan might take 6 months to reach London. The recipient would read it, think about it for a week, and then write a reply that would take another 6 months to return. It was a global conversation that happened in slow motion, a world where news of a new orchid was more exciting than a change in government. As we imagine a plant hunter sitting in a rain-soaked tent in the middle of a forest, carefully sketching the veins of a leaf by the light of a single candle, we see the beauty of being completely absorbed in the small. The world is vast, yes, but for him, the world is just the width of a petal. The rain taps on the canvas, the ink dries slowly in the humid air, and the mountains are silent and unmoving. The leaves are pressed, the seeds are sorted, and the long journey home begins. It is a world of green shadows and quiet growth, a place where the only thing that matters is the next bud, the next leaf, and the long, slow passage of the seasons. Chapter 15. The Frozen Stillness of the Arctic Winter. From the humid, fern-filled conservatories of Victorian England, we drift north, further north than the plant hunters ever dared, into the blinding, silent white of the Arctic Circle. In the mid-19th century, polar exploration was less about discovery and more about the art of being very patiently trapped in the ice. When a ship like the HMS Erebus or the Terror headed into the Northwest Passage, the crews knew that for at least 9 months of the year, their world would be reduced to the wooden hull of a ship frozen solid in a pack of ice. The life of a sailor trapped in the winter ice was a masterclass in scheduled boredom. To keep the men from descending into a polar melancholy, the officers enforced a routine that was almost comical in its rigidity. They would clear the snow off the decks to create a promenade where the men were required to walk for exercise, pacing back and forth in the sub-zero darkness like clockwork figures. They held Arctic schools, where grizzled sailors who had spent their lives at sea sat in cramped, candlelit cabins learning how to write their names or do basic long division. It was a world where the most exciting event of the week was a lecture on the history of the steam engine or a play performed by the crew in drag using old curtains for dresses. The silence of the Arctic was unlike anything else on Earth. Outside the ship, there was no wind, no birds, and no running water. It was a silence so thick you could hear the blood pumping in your own ears. Every now and then, the ice would groan, a deep, tectonic sound that vibrated through the hull, but mostly, it was just the sound of the men breathing and the occasional tick of the cooling stove. They lived in a dim, orange-lit world of felt boots and heavy wool, waiting for a sun that wouldn't rise for months. One of the most characteristic pastimes was the creation of ice journals. These were handwritten newspapers produced by the crew, filled with bad poetry, puns about penguins, and fake advertisements for shops that were thousands of miles away. It was a way to pretend that time was moving, even when the ship hadn't moved an inch in 6 months. They were curators of their own isolation, documenting the exact temperature of the soup and the precise thickness of the frost on the cabin walls. As the months dragged on, the men became experts in the microenvironment. They knew every knot in the wood of their bunks. They knew the exact sequence of the stars that passed over the hatch. There is something deeply peaceful about the idea of a ship being a tiny, warm bubble of humanity in an infinite, frozen void. The world outside didn't matter because it didn't exist. There was only the stove, the book, the walk on the deck, and the wait for the ice to crack. Chapter 16. The Delicate Geometry of the Lace Makers. Let's float away from the frozen ships and settle in a much warmer, though equally quiet, place. A convent in 17th century Flanders. While the explorers were measuring the ice, the lace makers were measuring the air. Lace making, specifically bobbin lace, was a task that required such a high level of concentration and such a low level of physical movement that it was practically a form of secular meditation. Imagine a room filled with 50 women, all sitting in perfect silence. Each woman has a pillow on her lap, a firm, straw-filled cushion with a parchment pattern pinned to it. Hanging from the pillow are dozens, sometimes hundreds, of small wooden bobbins, each wound with a thread as fine as a human hair. The sound of a lace-making room wasn't the sound of voices. It was the click-click-click of the bobbins as they were tossed and crossed over one another. It was the sound of a very slow, very soft wooden rain. To make just 1 square inch of high-quality point de gaze, or Brussels lace, a woman might have to work for weeks. They worked in rooms with whitewashed walls to maximize the light, often sitting near windows that looked out onto still canals or quiet gardens. In the winter, they would use glass globes filled with water to focus the light of a single candle onto their work, creating a tiny, intense beam of clarity in the darkness. They were architects of the invisible, building structures out of nothing but holes and thread. The patterns had names like the spider, the rose, or the snowflake. But the lace makers didn't see the whole pattern, they only saw the next pin. They lived their lives 1 millimeter at a time. It was a world where a mistake made on a Tuesday might not be noticed until Friday, requiring hours of patient unraveling. It was a life of quiet perfectionism. There was no room for hurry. If you hurried, the thread snapped, and the silence was broken. There is a profound stillness in the image of a lace maker. She is the center of a web of her own making. As she works, the world outside, the wars of Louis XIV, the rise of the Dutch Republic, the discovery of new continents, all of it fades away. There is only the click of the wood, the prick of the pin, and the slow, steady growth of the white mesh. It is a masterpiece of boredom, a life dedicated to the creation of something beautiful, fragile, and entirely unnecessary. As we imagine the lace being folded into blue tissue paper and the bobbins being laid to rest for the night, we feel the same peace that the Arctic sailors felt in their bunks. The work is done for the day. The ice is still frozen, the lace is still growing. The world is exactly as it was, and that is more than enough. The candles are snuffed out, the click of the wood falls silent, and the shadows of the convent walls stretch out to meet the dark. We are drifting now further and further into the quiet of the night, where the only thing left to do is let go. Chapter 17. The Art of Listening to Incense. We drift now from the clicking bobbins of Flanders to the refined, hushed tea rooms of Japan during the Muromachi period. While most of the world was busy smelling things just to see if they were edible, the Japanese aristocracy developed kodo, or the way of incense. But they didn't just smell the incense, they listened to it. To listen to incense is to engage in a ceremony so slow and so subtle that it makes watching paint dry look like an action movie. In a kodo ceremony, a small group of people sits in a perfect circle on tamemats. The room is sparse, perhaps a single scroll on the wall and a vase with a solitary branch. The censer master, prepares a tiny piece of fragrant wood, often agarwood or sandalwood, which has been aged for decades, sometimes centuries. This wood isn't burned, it is placed on a tiny mica plate, which sits atop a mound of ash, heated from below by a single piece of glowing charcoal. The goal is to release the aroma without producing any smoke. Smoke is considered noisy. We only want the whisper of the scent. The participants pass the censer around. When it reaches you, you cradle it in your palms, take 3 deep, mindful breaths, and listen. You are trying to identify the soul of the wood. Is it Manaban, which is sweet and slightly coarse? Or is it Kiara, which is dignified and cool? There are games played during these sessions, like Kumiko, where you listen to several different scents and have to identify which ones are the same. You record your answers using specialized calligraphy brushes on beautiful, handmade paper. The life of a Kodo practitioner was a life of extreme sensory deprivation followed by extreme sensory focus. They would avoid spicy foods, perfumes, or even strong-smelling flowers for days before a ceremony to ensure their ears were sharp. It was a world of micro-differences. They would debate for hours whether a particular scent felt more like a mountain temple in spring or a lonely shore in autumn. It was a masterpiece of aristocratic boredom, a way to stretch a single moment of fragrance into an entire afternoon of philosophical reflection. Chapter 18. The Rhythmic Ink of the Scriptoria. As the scent of sandalwood fades, we travel back to the cold, stone corridors of a medieval European monastery, perhaps in the 10th century. We are entering the scriptorium. This was the room where books were born, but they weren't written, they were drawn. A monk assigned to the scriptorium was a man who had traded the physical world for the world of the letter. Imagine sitting on a hard wooden bench for 6 hours a day, leaning over a piece of vellum, dried calfskin, that has been scraped until it is as smooth as silk. Your only tools are a quill made from a goose feather, a small knife to sharpen it, and a pot of ink made from oak galls and iron salts. The scriptorium was a place of absolute silence. If a monk needed to ask for a specific book, he had to use sign language. If he wanted a lectionary, he would make the sign of the cross. If he wanted a pagan text, he would scratch his ear like a dog. The work was agonizingly slow. A single page of a Bible might take a week to complete. The monk would labor over the initial, the large decorative letter at the start of a chapter, filling it with tiny interlocking vines, mythical beasts, and flecks of real gold leaf. This was illumination. They believed that by making the Word of God beautiful, they were performing an act of prayer. But it was a prayer that required the patience of a mountain. One monk wrote in the margin of his manuscript, 3 fingers write, but the whole body labors. As the sailor longs for the port, so the writer longs for the last line. The life of the copyist was a life of controlled repetition. You wrote the same prayers, the same gospels, the same psalms year after year. Your identity disappeared into the script. The goal wasn't to be original, it was to be a perfect conduit for the past. They lived in a world of black letter and uncial, where the shape of a curve was more important than the news of the day. Outside, Vikings might be raiding the coast or kings might be falling, but inside the scriptorium, the only thing that mattered was that the ink didn't smudge and the vellum stayed dry. There is something deeply comforting about the scriptorium. It was a factory of silence. Thousands of years of human thought were preserved by men who spent their lives staring at a 2-inch square of parchment. As the sun set and the light in the scriptorium failed, the monk would carefully wipe his quill, close his ink pot, and leave his work for the next day. The book was never finished quickly. It grew, like a forest, 1 leaf at a time. We can see them now, the listeners of incense and the drawers of letters. They are the guardians of the slow. They remind us that the most profound things in life don't scream, they whisper. They require us to sit still, to breathe, and to wait for the scent to rise or the ink to dry. The monastery bell rings for vespers, the incense censer is placed back in its box, and the world sinks into a deep, scholarly slumber. The night is long, the silence is total, and the past is exactly where it belongs, tucked away in the quiet corners of the heart. Chapter 19. The Loneliness of the Freshwater Lighthouse. Leaving the silent ink-stained desks of the monks, we drift across the Atlantic and into the heart of North America, toward the Great Lakes in the late 19th century. While the ocean-facing lighthouses get all the drama and the crashing waves, the lighthouses of Lake Superior and Lake Huron offered a different kind of solitude, a freshwater, rhythmic, and deeply repetitive kind of peace. To be a lighthouse keeper on a remote island like Stannard Rock, known as the loneliest place in the world, was to enter a pact with the horizon. You lived in a stone tower surrounded by nothing but cold, gray water that stretched until it met a cold, gray sky. Your entire existence was governed by the wick. Every evening as the sun dipped low, you climbed the spiral stairs, step by slow step, to the lantern room. You trimmed the charred bit of the lamp wick, polished the massive Fresnel lens until the glass sparkled like a diamond, and lit the oil. The Fresnel lens was a masterpiece of 19th century glasswork, a giant hive of prisms designed to catch every stray photon and bend it into a single, concentrated beam of light. A keeper would spend hours with a chamois cloth, buffing out tiny fingerprints or flecks of dust. It was a life of micro-maintenance. If the light didn't rotate, you had to wind the clockwork mechanism, a system of heavy weights that dropped slowly down the center of the tower. It was the heartbeat of the island, a steady thump tick that let you know the world was still turning. During the day, the boredom was monumental. The keepers painted everything. They painted the stairs, the railings, the walls, and then they painted them again. They kept logbooks, where they recorded the most infinitesimal changes in the weather. Wind, north-northwest. Sky, hazy. Observed one seagull on the pier. It stayed for 20 minutes. This wasn't just record-keeping, it was a way to prove that time hadn't frozen solid. They lived on a diet of tinned meat, hardtack, and the occasional fish they caught from the gallery. It was a life reduced to the essentials: light, oil, and the endless, flat water. In a kodo ceremony, a small group of people sits in a perfect circle on tame mats. The room is sparse, perhaps a single scroll on the wall and a vase with a solitary branch. The censer master prepares a tiny piece of fragrant wood, often agarwood or sandalwood, which has been aged for decades, sometimes centuries. This wood isn't burned, it is placed on a tiny mica plate, which sits atop a mound of ash, heated from below by a single piece of glowing charcoal. The goal is to release the aroma without producing any smoke. Smoke is considered noisy. We only want the whisper of the scent. The participants pass the censer around. When it reaches you, you cradle it in your palms, take 3 deep, mindful breaths, and listen. You are trying to identify the soul of the wood. Is it Manaban, which is sweet and slightly coarse? Or is it Kiara, which is dignified and cool? There are games played during these sessions, like Kumiko, where you listen to several different scents and have to identify which ones are the same. You record your answers using specialized calligraphy brushes on beautiful, handmade paper. The life of a kodo practitioner was a life of extreme sensory deprivation followed by extreme sensory focus. They would avoid spicy foods, perfumes, or even strong-smelling flowers for days before a ceremony to ensure their ears were sharp. It was a world of micro-differences. They would debate for hours whether a particular scent felt more like a mountain temple in spring or a lonely shore in autumn. It was a masterpiece of aristocratic boredom, a way to stretch a single moment of fragrance into an entire afternoon of philosophical reflection. Chapter 18. The Rhythmic Ink of the Scriptoria. As the scent of sandalwood fades, we travel back to the cold, stone corridors of a medieval European monastery, perhaps in the 10th century. We are entering the scriptorium. This was the room where books were born, but they weren't written, they were drawn. A monk assigned to the scriptorium was a man who had traded the physical world for the world of the letter. Imagine sitting on a hard wooden bench for 6 hours a day, leaning over a piece of vellum, dried calfskin, that has been scraped until it is as smooth as silk. Your only tools are a quill made from a goose feather, a small knife to sharpen it, and a pot of ink made from oak galls and iron salts. The scriptorium was a place of absolute silence. If a monk needed to ask for a specific book, he had to use sign language. If he wanted a lectionary, he would make the sign of the cross. If he wanted a pagan text, he would scratch his ear like a dog. The work was agonizingly slow. A single page of a Bible might take a week to complete. The monk would labor over the initial, the large decorative letter at the start of a chapter, filling it with tiny interlocking vines, mythical beasts, and flecks of real gold leaf. This was illumination. They believed that by making the Word of God beautiful, they were performing an act of prayer. But it was a prayer that required the patience of a mountain. One monk wrote in the margin of his manuscript, "3 fingers write, but the whole body labors. As the sailor longs for the port, so the writer longs for the last line." The life of the copyist was a life of controlled repetition. You wrote the same prayers, the same gospels, the same psalms year after year. Your identity disappeared into the script. The goal wasn't to be original, it was to be a perfect conduit for the past. They lived in a world of black letter and uncial, where the shape of a curve was more important than the news of the day. Outside, Vikings might be raiding the coast or kings might be falling, but inside the scriptorium, the only thing that mattered was that the ink didn't smudge and the vellum stayed dry. There is something deeply comforting about the scriptorium. It was a factory of silence. Thousands of years of human thought were preserved by men who spent their lives staring at a 2-inch square of parchment. As the sun set and the light in the scriptorium failed, the monk would carefully wipe his quill, close his ink pot, and leave his work for the next day. The book was never finished quickly. It grew, like a forest, 1 leaf at a time. We can see them now, the listeners of incense and the drawers of letters. They are the guardians of the slow. They remind us that the most profound things in life don't scream, they whisper. They require us to sit still, to breathe, and to wait for the scent to rise or the ink to dry. The monastery bell rings for vespers, the incense censer is placed back in its box, and the world sinks into a deep, scholarly slumber. The night is long, the silence is total, and the past is exactly where it belongs, tucked away in the quiet corners of the heart. Chapter 19. The Loneliness of the Freshwater Lighthouse. Leaving the silent, ink-stained desks of the monks, we drift across the Atlantic and into the heart of North America, toward the Great Lakes in the late 19th century. While the ocean-facing lighthouses get all the drama and the crashing waves, the lighthouses of Lake Superior and Lake Huron offered a different kind of solitude, a freshwater, rhythmic, and deeply repetitive kind of peace. To be a lighthouse keeper on a remote island like Stannard Rock, known as the loneliest place in the world, was to enter a pact with the horizon. You lived in a stone tower surrounded by nothing but cold, gray water that stretched until it met a cold, gray sky. Your entire existence was governed by the wick. Every evening as the sun dipped low, you climbed the spiral stairs, step by slow step, to the lantern room. You trimmed the charred bit of the lamp wick, polished the massive Fresnel lens until the glass sparkled like a diamond, and lit the oil. The Fresnel lens was a masterpiece of 19th century glasswork, a giant hive of prisms designed to catch every stray photon and bend it into a single, concentrated beam of light. A keeper would spend hours with a chamois cloth, buffing out tiny fingerprints or flecks of dust. It was a life of micro-maintenance. If the light didn't rotate, you had to wind the clockwork mechanism, a system of heavy weights that dropped slowly down the center of the tower. It was the heartbeat of the island, a steady thump tick that let you know the world was still turning. During the day, the boredom was monumental. The keepers painted everything. They painted the stairs, the railings, the walls, and then they painted them again. They kept logbooks, where they recorded the most infinitesimal changes in the weather. Wind, north-northwest. Sky, hazy. Observed one seagull on the pier. It stayed for 20 minutes. This wasn't just record-keeping, it was a way to prove that time hadn't frozen solid. They lived on a diet of tinned meat, hardtack, and the occasional fish they caught from the gallery. It was a life reduced to the essentials: light, oil, and the endless, flat water. Chapter 20. The Internal Universe of the Watchmaker. From the giant clockwork of the lighthouse, we shrink our focus down to the smallest gears imaginable. We are in the workshops of the early Swiss and English watchmakers, men like Abraham Louis Breguet or George Daniels. If the lighthouse keeper lived in a world of miles, The watchmaker lived in a world of microns. Imagine a man sitting at a workbench near a north-facing window. The light is more consistent there, you see. He wears a loupe, a magnifying glass, over one eye, turning him into a sort of mechanical cyclops. His world is the plate of a pocket watch, a tiny brass landscape where he must plant jewels, usually rubies or sapphires, to act as frictionless bearings for the gears. He isn't using a hammer, he's using tweezers so delicate they could pick up a single hair from a moth's wing. The hairspring was the soul of the watch, a coil of steel so thin and temperamental that even the heat from the watchmaker's breath could change its tension. To vibrate, a hairspring was to spend an entire day nudging a tiny piece of metal until it pulsed at exactly the right frequency. It was a task that required the heart rate of a hibernating bear. If you got frustrated, if your hand shook for even a fraction of a second, the work of a month was ruined. These men didn't see themselves as manufacturers. They were sculptors of time. They created complications, clocks that showed the phases of the moon, the day of the week, or even the equation of time, the difference between sundial time and clock time. They were building a perfect, miniature universe that you could fit in your waistcoat pocket. While the world outside was loud with the steam engines and the screams of the industrial age, the watchmaker's shop was a vacuum of focus, filled only with the sound of a tiny, rhythmic lever escapement finding its beat. There is a profound stillness in the watchmaker's art. It is the belief that if you can just get the gears to mesh perfectly, if you can just eliminate the friction, you can capture a piece of eternity. It is a life lived between the ticks, a quiet rebellion against the chaos of the world. As the watchmaker finally snaps the case shut and listens to the first, faint heartbeat of his creation, he isn't looking at the time. He's looking at the order. As we imagine the lighthouse beams sweeping across the dark water and the watch ticking under a pillow, we see the two scales of human patience. The large and the small, both steady, both unhurried. The light keeps the ship safe. The watch keeps the seconds in their place. Everything is regulated. Everything is calm. The oil in the lamp is full, the mainspring of the watch is wound, and the night is held in a perfect, mechanical balance. The world is asleep, but the machines are watching over us, ticking and sweeping in the dark, a soft lullaby for a world that has finally stopped rushing. Chapter 21. The Ornamental Hermits of the English Estate. As we leave the precision of the watchmaker's bench, we drift back to the rolling green hills of 18th century England. This was the era of the picturesque, a time when wealthy landowners decided that their gardens weren't quite complete unless they featured a touch of manufactured melancholy. To achieve this, they built grottos, fake caves made of flint, shells, and moss, and then they did something truly peculiar. They hired a human being to live in them. This was the ornamental hermit. If you were an eccentric gentleman with a large estate, you might take out an advertisement in the local paper seeking a man willing to live in your garden for 7 years. The contract usually specified that the hermit must not cut his hair, his beard, or his nails. He was forbidden from wearing shoes and had to wear a simple, scratchy robe made of camel hair or burlap. Most importantly, he was forbidden from speaking to the guests. He was essentially a piece of living garden furniture, designed to remind visitors of the fleeting nature of life and the beauty of solitude. The life of an ornamental hermit was a marathon of sanctioned boredom. Imagine sitting in a cold, damp cave for 14 hours a day, surrounded by memento mori, skulls, hourglasses, and old, dusty books, waiting for a group of aristocrats to walk by and go at your commitment to the aesthetic. The hermit's only job was to look contemplative. He might spend his time staring at a single piece of moss or slowly carving a wooden spoon. He was a professional introvert, paid in room, board, and a small stipend to be a ghost in the landscape. Many of these hermits didn't last the full 7 years. The dampness of the grottos and the sheer, crushing weight of doing absolutely nothing often drove them back to the village pub within a few months. But those who stayed became part of the rhythm of the estate. They were the slow pulse of the garden, a reminder that while the world outside was obsessed with the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, some people were still willing to sit in a cave and watch the shadows move across a stone floor. It was a life of performative stillness, a quiet, mossy corner in the history of human eccentricity. Chapter 22: The Alchemist of Color and the Dye Maker's Vat. From the gray flint of the hermit's cave, we move into a world of vibrant, saturated hues, the workshop of the early modern dye maker. Before the invention of synthetic colors in the mid-19th century, color was something you had to coax out of the earth, the sea, and the forest with agonizing patience. Imagine a dye master in the 17th century trying to produce a perfect Tyrian purple or a deep, madder red. His world was one of vats, steam, and incredible smells. To get the color of kings, the purple, you needed the murex sea snail. Each snail produced only a tiny drop of clear fluid that turned purple when exposed to air. You needed thousands of snails just to dye the hem of a robe. The process was slow, stinky, and required the dye master to sit by the vat for days, stirring the liquid with a long wooden paddle, watching the chemistry of the sun and the oxygen do its work. Then there was indigo. To create a stable blue, the dye maker had to ferment the leaves of the indigo plant in a deep pit. This wasn't a job for the impatient. You had to monitor the temperature, the pH, and the smell of the fermenting sludge. If the vat died, the color was lost. A dye maker lived in a state of chromatic anxiety. He would spend his days dipping small scraps of wool into the vat, holding them up to the light, and waiting for the moment the color struck. The most precious of all was cochineal, a brilliant red made from the dried bodies of tiny insects found on cacti in the Americas. Millions of these bugs had to be handpicked with soft brushes, dried in the sun, and ground into a fine powder. A dye master would treat this powder like gold, measuring it out in tiny increments. He was a chemist of the slow, a man who understood that the most beautiful colors in the world are the ones that take the longest to arrive. In the dye shop, time was measured by the dip. You dipped the fabric, you dried it, you dipped it again. To get a deep, fast color, this might be repeated 20 times. It was a life of saturated repetition, a world where the goal was to capture the essence of a plant or an insect and lock it forever into the fibers of a piece of silk. As the dye master hung the long strips of colored cloth to dry in the wind, the workshop would fall silent, filled only with the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the excess color hitting the stone floor. As we imagine the hermit in his mossy cave and the dye master by his steaming vat, we see the two ways humans interact with the world, by disappearing into it or by trying to capture its beauty. Both require a stillness that we rarely find today. The hermit finds peace in the gray, the dye maker finds it in the red. Both are content to wait for the world to reveal itself. The sun sets over the English garden, the vats in the dye shop are covered for the night, and the colors fade into the soft, universal blue of the twilight. The world is resting, the work is done, and the silence is as deep and rich as a piece of triple-dipped indigo silk. Chapter 23: The Patient Blade of the Woodblock Carver. Leaving the steaming vats of the dye master, we drift back to Japan, specifically to a quiet workshop in Edo during the early 19th century. We are here to observe the creation of a ukiyo-e print, but we aren't looking at the artist who drew it. We are looking at the carver, the man whose entire life is defined by the resistance of cherry wood against a steel blade. Imagine a man sitting on a thin mat, his back curved like a bow, leaning over a block of seasoned mountain cherry. This wood is chosen because it is hard enough to hold a line as thin as a single strand of hair, yet soft enough to yield to a master's touch. The carver has a hanshitei, a thin paper drawing, pasted face down onto the block. He rubs the paper with his palm until it is almost transparent, revealing the ink lines beneath. Now his work begins. It is a task that will take him weeks of absolute, motionless focus. The carver uses a two or a small, razor-sharp chisel. He doesn't cut the line, he cuts the wood away from the line. Every single stroke of the artist's brush must be preserved in relief. If the artist's brush flickered for a millisecond, the carver must replicate that flicker in wood. He breathes in a slow, shallow rhythm to keep his hands perfectly still. A single slip of the blade, a fraction of a millimeter too deep, and the entire block is ruined. There is no undo button in the world of Edo woodcuts. There is only the slow, rhythmic scritch-scritch, of the blade and the piling up of tiny pale wood shavings that look like fallen cherry blossoms. The most difficult part is the hairline. To carve the hairline of a beautiful woman or the fine spray of a wave, the carver must be more machine than man. He works in a world of microscopic detail, his eyes inches from the wood, his world narrowed down to a space the size of a postage stamp. He is the ultimate slow-motion translator, turning fluid ink into rigid wood. Once the key block is finished, he must carve a separate block for every single color, sometimes 20 or 30 blocks for a single print. It is a monumental exercise in repetition and precision. Chapter 24. The Quiet Observers of the Clouds. From the woodcarver's bench, we float up into the atmosphere, or at least as far as a 19th century weather observer could climb. Before satellites and digital sensors, the weather was something you had to watch with your own eyes, day after day, year after year. Imagine a man like Luke Howard, the namer of clouds, or a lonely observer stationed on the summit of Ben Nevis in Scotland. His life was a long, cold conversation with the sky. Every day, at exactly the same times, 9 a.m., 12 p.m., 3 p.m., and so on, he would step outside to read his instruments. He would check the hygrometer for humidity, the barometer for pressure, and the anemometer for wind speed. He recorded these numbers in a leather-bound ledger with a steady, unhurried hand. But the most important part of his job was the cloud journal. He would sit on a wooden bench, staring at the sky, and try to categorize the infinite, shifting shapes of the vapor. He was the one who gave us the names we use today: cirrus, cumulus, stratus. For a weather observer, a cloud wasn't just a cloud, it was a narrative. He watched the cirrostratus thicken into altostratus, signaling a change that might not arrive for another 12 hours. He lived in atmospheric time, a world where the most significant event of the week was a shift in the wind or a particular shade of gray on the horizon. These observers were the librarians of the air. They understood that the weather is a slow, global machine, and that the only way to understand it is to watch it without blinking. They spent decades in isolated towers or on remote coastlines, often alone, with only the ticking of their barometers for company. There is a profound peace in the life of someone who has decided that the movement of a cloud is more important than the movement of an army. It is a life of quiet vigilance, a long, slow gaze into the infinite blue. As we imagine the carver finishing his block and the observer closing his ledger for the night, we see the beauty of the long view. The carver creates a world out of wood. The observer maps a world out of air. Both require a heart that is content to beat slowly and a mind that is happy to stay in one place. The shavings are swept from the floor, the barometer is steady, and the night sky is filled with high, silent clouds that no one is watching but us. The world is tucked in, the tools are put away, and the great, slow rhythm of the earth continues its steady, unhurried pulse. Chapter 25. The Silent Stone Watchers of the Jurassic Coast. As the clouds drift away, we descend from the atmosphere back to the rugged, crumbling cliffs of Dorset, England, in the early 1800s. While the rest of the world was accelerating into the age of steam, a young woman named Mary Anning was slowing down to the speed of erosion. She spent her days walking the beaches of Lyme Regis, eyes fixed on the gray-blue lias clay, waiting for the sea to give up its secrets. To be a fossil hunter in the 19th century was to live a life of geological patience. You didn't find fossils by digging frantically, you found them by walking the same stretch of beach every single morning after a storm, waiting for the waves to peel back a layer of the earth like a page in a very old book. Mary Anning would spend hours, sometimes days, sitting on the wet shingle, delicately tapping at a piece of limestone with a small hammer. The sound of the hammer against the stone was the only rhythm of her day. Clink, 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 matched only by the slow, repetitive pull of the tide. Imagine the stillness required to uncover an ichthyosaur. You aren't just moving dirt, you are performing surgery on time itself. With a tiny needle and a soft brush, you clear away 100 million years of silt, one grain at a time. It might take a month to reveal a single vertebrae. For Mary, the world of 1820, the politics, the fashion, the noise of London, was entirely irrelevant. Her world was the curve of a fossilized rib or the texture of a prehistoric tooth. She was a curator of the ancient, a woman who lived in a timeline where a century was just a blink of an eye. There is something deeply meditative about the fossil hunter's life. It is a pursuit that rewards those who are willing to be as unmoving as the stones they seek. You have to learn to read the cliffside to see the subtle difference in color that signals a bone rather than a rock. It is a life of quiet discovery, where the greatest thrill isn't a loud shout of "Eureka!" but the soft, dusty realization that you are the first human being to see a creature that has been sleeping in the dark for an eternity. Chapter 26: The Whispering Dust of the Vatican Secret Archives. From the salty air of the Dorset coast, we float across Europe to the heart of Rome, entering the most silent place on earth, the Archivium Secretum Vaticanum. This isn't just a library, it is 85 kilometers of shelving tucked away behind stone walls, containing the paperwork of 1,000 years of human bureaucracy. The life of an archivist in the Vatican is a masterclass in scholarly hibernation. You live in a world of Borghese paper and parchment rolls, where the air is kept at a constant, cool temperature and the only sound is the soft thud of a heavy box being placed on a wooden table. Here, the letters of kings, the excommunications of emperors, and the reports of explorers are all treated with the same level of slow, methodical care. An archivist might spend 3 years cataloging a single decade of correspondence from the 16th century. They don't skim, they transcribe. They decipher the cramped, Latinate handwriting of a tired secretary who died 500 years ago. They are the ghosts of the record, men and women who have decided that the most important thing they can do with their lives is to ensure that a piece of paper remains exactly where it was put in 1612. The archives are a fortress of the mundane. While history books focus on the wars and the scandals, the archivist focuses on the receipts. They read the grocery bills of popes and the travel expenses of cardinals. They see history not as a grand drama, but as an endless series of small, polite transactions. It is a life of archival peace, a world where the passage of time is measured in the thickness of the dust on a box lid and the gradual yellowing of a page. In the archives, there is no now. There is only a vast, interconnected then. As the archivist closes a folder and ties the cotton string in a neat bow, they are tucking away a piece of the human story, keeping it safe in the dark, silent halls. The world outside the Vatican walls is loud with traffic and tourists, but inside, the only thing that moves is the slow, steady hand of the scholar and the quiet, drifting dust of the centuries. As we imagine Mary Anning looking at her fossils and the archivist looking at his scrolls, we see the beauty of the unbroken line. Both are looking for the truth in things that have been left behind. Both are content to be still, to be quiet, and to wait for the past to speak in its own time. The tide is coming in at Lyme Regis, covering the stones once more. The lights are being dimmed in the long corridors of the archives. The hammers are put away, the boxes are closed, and the world sinks into a deep, historical slumber. The past is safe, the secrets are kept, and the silence is as vast and cool as the stone walls of Rome. Chapter 27: The High-Altitude Breath of the Himalayan Tea Growers. We drift now away from the dusty, silent halls of the Vatican and travel east, rising higher and higher until the air becomes thin and crisp. We are in the foothills of the Himalayas, specifically in the Darjeeling and Assam regions during the mid-19th century. Here, the art of tea wasn't the ceremony of the Tang Dynasty we started with, but a life of vertical patience. Imagine a tea garden perched on a slope so steep it feels like the edge of the world. The workers here live in a world of permanent mist. The clouds don't just pass over, they live among the bushes. To grow tea at this altitude is to engage in a slow-motion dance with the elements. You don't just plant a bush and walk away. You have to wait for the first flush, the very first buds of spring that emerge after the winter dormancy. These tiny, pale green tips are so delicate they must be picked by hand, one by one, with a touch so light it wouldn't bruise a butterfly's wing. The life of a tea grower is a masterpiece of rhythmic labor. They move across the slopes in a steady, horizontal line, their fingers flickering like dragonflies over the bushes. Snap, snap, snap. 2 leaves and a bud. That is the golden rule. Anything more is too coarse, anything less is a waste. They carry large wicker baskets on their backs, held by a strap across the forehead, and the only sound is the soft rustle of the leaves and the distant, muffled ring of a temple bell from a valley 3,000 feet below. Back at the factory, which is really just a large, open-sided wooden shed, the tea begins its withering. This is the most boring and therefore most essential part of the process. The leaves are spread out on long wire trays, and they just sit there for 20 hours. The tea maker walks by every now and then, sniffs the air, and feels the limpness of the leaf. He is waiting for the moisture to evaporate at exactly the right rate. If it's too fast, the tea is brittle. If it's too slow, it rots. He is a curator of evaporation, a man who has decided that watching a leaf go limp is a worthy way to spend a Tuesday. There is a profound stillness in the high-altitude tea gardens. Because of the thin air, everyone moves a little slower. Your heart beats a little steadier. You spend your days looking at 100 shades of green and your nights listening to the silence of the snow-capped peaks. It is a life lived in seasonal time, where the only deadlines are the arrival of the monsoon and the first frost of autumn. Chapter 28: The Wool Gatherers and the Infinite Pasture. From the misty mountains of the east, we float back to the rolling, desolate moors of medieval England and Spain. This is the world of the shepherd, the original practitioners of the long, slow watch. In the Middle Ages, wool was the gold of Europe, but to get that gold, you had to be willing to spend months in absolute, woolly isolation. Imagine a shepherd in the 13th century. His world is not the village or the church. His world is the flock. He lives in a shepherd's hut, a tiny wooden box on wheels that he drags from pasture to pasture. His only companions are a loyal, shaggy dog and 500 sheep who are collectively committed to being as slow and as stubborn as possible. The life of a shepherd is a masterclass in pastoral boredom. You aren't driving the sheep, you are drifting with them. You move at the speed of a grazing mouth. The shepherd's day is measured in grazing cycles. He sits on a stone wall, leaning on a tall wooden crook, and watches the sheep eat. That's it. For 14 hours. He watches the way the light changes on the heather. He watches the hawk circling a mile above. He watches the grass slowly disappear. To pass the time, shepherds became the masters of the small craft. They carved intricate patterns into their crooks. They played simple, haunting melodies on bone flutes. They memorized every single star in the night sky, giving them names that only shepherds knew. In Spain, the Mesta would organize the transhumance, the massive, slow migration of millions of merino sheep from the north to the south for the winter. This was a river of wool that moved across the landscape at 2 miles an hour. It was a world of dust and bleeding, a rhythmic, nomadic existence that had remained unchanged since the time of the Romans. The shepherds lived in a state of constant exteriority. They didn't have walls, they had the horizon. They didn't have clocks, they had the sun and the shadows of the hills. There is a deep, ancient peace in the life of the shepherd. It is the realization that the world doesn't need us to be busy. The grass grows, the sheep eat, the wool thickens, and the seasons turn, all without a single person checking their watch or sending a message. The shepherd is the silent witness to the earth's own pace. As we imagine the tea maker sniffing his withering leaves and the shepherd leaning on his carved staff, we see the beauty of the uncomplicated life. Both are centered on the basic needs of the world, growth and warmth. Both require a person who is happy to be alone, happy to be quiet, and happy to let the day take as long as it needs to take. The mist settles over the Himalayan slopes, the sheep huddle together in the lee of a stone wall, and the world sinks into a deep, earthy slumber. The wool is soft, the tea is warm, and the silence is as vast and comforting as a heavy woolen blanket. Chapter 29: The Clockwork Stars of the Royal Observatory. Leaving the dusty sheep trails of the moors, we drift toward a small, white-domed building on a hill in Greenwich. We are entering the Royal Observatory in the late 18th century. If the shepherd's life was measured by the movement of the flock, the astronomer's life was measured by the movement of the universe, which, as it turns out, is the slowest and most predictable flock of all. To be an astronomer royal, like Neville Maskelyne, was to live a life of celestial bookkeeping. You didn't just look at stars, you timed them. The primary tool was the transit circle, a massive telescope fixed so that it could only move up and down, perfectly aligned with the meridian. The astronomer would sit in a darkened room, eye pressed to the lens, waiting for a specific star to drift across a tiny vertical hair in the viewfinder. Imagine the stillness required. You are sitting in the cold, night air, your breath misting in front of you. You have a ticking pendulum clock nearby, a regulator, and a pen poised over a ledger. You wait. The star, a tiny pinprick of light, moves with agonizing slowness. When it hits the wire, you click a button or make a mark. Tick. Then you wait 20 minutes for the next one. It was a life of fragmented patience. You were the clerk of the cosmos, recording the arrival times of light that had been traveling for thousands of years. The goal of all this was the Nautical Almanac, a massive book of numbers that told sailors where the moon would be at any given second. This meant years of reduction, the process of taking raw observations and turning them into tables of data using nothing but long division and logarithmic tables. It was a world of hushed voices, the steady tock-tock of the master clock, and the scratch of quills on parchment. The astronomers lived in a state of extended present, where the most exciting event was a transit of Venus that happened twice a century. Chapter 30: The Varnished Silence of the Cremonese Workshop. From the infinite scale of the stars, we shrink back down to the curve of a piece of maple wood. We are in Cremona, Italy, in the late 17th century, standing in the workshop of Antonio Stradivari. While the astronomers were mapping the sky, Stradivari was mapping the soul of a tree. The life of a violin maker is a life of tactile meditation. You start by choosing the wood, spruce for the top, maple for the back, that has been seasoned for at least a decade. You don't use a saw, you use a scraper, a small piece of steel that removes shavings thinner than a dragonfly's wing. The sound of a violin workshop is a soft, rhythmic shuck-shuck-shuck as the wood is thinned, millimeter by millimeter. The most mysterious part of the process was the varnish. Stradivari would spend weeks in a sun-drenched courtyard, mixing oils, resins, and secret pigments. He would apply a layer, then wait days for it to dry in the gentle Italian breeze. Then he would sand it back and apply another. It was a layered existence. He wasn't building a tool, he was growing an instrument. He spent his days tapping on the wood, listening to the pitch of the plate before it was even assembled. He was a man who could hear the music inside a silent block of wood. There is a profound peace in the violin maker's bench. It is a world of wood glue, amber, and the smell of pine resin. The workshop is a sanctuary from the noise of the street. Stradivari produced about 1,100 instruments in his long life, which sounds like a lot until you realize he worked for 70 years. That's about 15 instruments a year. He wasn't in a hurry. He knew that the wood had its own time, and his job was simply to wait for it to speak. As we imagine the astronomer waiting for his star and the violin maker waiting for his varnish to dry, we see the beauty of attentive waiting. Both are looking for a perfect harmony, one in the heavens, one in the hand. Both require a person who is happy to let the clock tick, happy to be still, and happy to let the world unfold at its own natural pace. The dome of the observatory is closed for the morning, the violin is hanging from a hook to dry in the rafters, and the world sinks into a deep, resonant slumber. The stars are in their places, the wood is finding its voice, and the silence is as clear and bright as a well-timed pendulum. Chapter 31: The Salt-Stained Vigil of the Bell Rock. Leaving the quiet, varnished workshops of Cremona, we drift north once more, toward the treacherous, wave-swept reefs off the coast of Scotland. We are looking at the Bell Rock Lighthouse in the early 19th century. This wasn't just a lighthouse, it was a marvel of engineering built on a rock that was underwater for 20 hours a day. To be a keeper here was to live in a stone pillar in the middle of a restless, gray ocean, separated from the rest of humanity by 11 miles of salt spray. The life of a Bell Rock keeper was a masterpiece of enforced stability. Because the lighthouse was so isolated, the keepers worked in shifts of 6 weeks on and 2 weeks off. During those 6 weeks, Your world was a circle exactly 14 feet in diameter. You climbed the ladder from the engine room to the library, from the library to the bedroom, and from the bedroom to the light room. It was a vertical life, a rhythmic ascent and descent through a stack of granite rooms. Your primary duty was the watch. For 4 hours at a time, you sat in the lantern room, watching the great lamp. You had to ensure the oil was flowing steadily and that the heavy red and white glass shades were rotating at exactly the right speed. If the clockwork mechanism slowed down, you had to wind the massive weights back up. The sound of the lighthouse was a constant, low-frequency hum. The rotation of the gears, the hiss of the oil, and the muffled, rhythmic boom of the waves hitting the base 60 feet below. In their off hours, the keepers became the ultimate hobbyists. They read entire libraries of books. They practiced intricate knotwork. They wrote letters to their families that wouldn't be picked up by the supply boat for a month. There is a story of a keeper who spent his entire 6-week shift carving a miniature version of the lighthouse out of a single piece of soup bone. It was a life of peaceful confinement, a world where the most significant change was the tide going out to reveal the jagged, kelp-covered reef for a few precious hours of sunlight. Chapter 32. The Quiet Immortality of the Museum Taxidermist. From the salt-crusted granite of the Scottish coast, we move into the still, chemical-scented halls of a natural history museum in the late Victorian era. We are entering the workshop of the taxidermist. While the lighthouse keeper was preserving ships, the taxidermist was preserving a memory of life. Imagine a man sitting at a long wooden table, surrounded by glass eyes, wire frames, and bags of wood wool. His world is one of anatomical stillness. To mount a specimen, perhaps a rare bird or a graceful antelope, required a level of patience that bordered on the spiritual. You didn't just stuff an animal, you sculpted it from the inside out. You had to understand every muscle, every tendon, and every subtle curve of the body as it would have looked in motion. The process was agonizingly slow. First, the skin had to be cured in a pickle of alum and salt for weeks. Then, a clay or plaster model was built to act as the core. The most delicate part was the feather work. A taxidermist might spend 3 days using a pair of fine tweezers to position the feathers on a single wing so that they lay exactly as they would in nature. He lived in a world of permanent postures, a place where the goal was to capture a single second of a creature's life and hold it forever. There is a profound, dusty peace in the taxidermist's workshop. It is a world of suspended animation. The workshop is a sanctuary where time has been tricked into standing still. Outside, the world is aging, decaying, and changing, but inside, the tiger is forever mid-leap, and the owl is forever about to take flight. The taxidermist is the editor of death, a man who has decided that beauty is worth more than the passage of time. As we imagine the lighthouse keeper winding his weights and the taxidermist placing a glass eye with a steady hand, we see the beauty of preservation. Both are trying to keep something from disappearing into the dark or the dust. Both require a person who is content to work in silence, happy to be meticulous, and happy to let the world go by. The lighthouse beam sweeps over the empty sea, the museum doors are locked for the night, and the world sinks into a deep, unchanging slumber. The light is steady, the specimens are still, and the silence is as thick and comforting as the velvet curtains of a Victorian gallery. Chapter 33. The Gliding World of the Canal Boatman. From the salt-heavy air of the Bell Rock, we drift inland to the mirror-still waters of the British canal system in the mid-1800s. While the steam trains were beginning to tear across the landscape at the terrifying speed of 30 miles per hour, the canal boatmen were committed to a life lived at a walking pace. Their world was exactly 7 feet wide and moved at precisely 4 miles per hour, the speed of a steady, rhythmic horse. Imagine living on a narrowboat, a long, slender vessel decorated with castles and roses, vibrant, folk art paintings that turned a cargo of coal into a floating palace. The boatman didn't live on the water so much as he lived with it. His life was a series of reaches and locks. A lock was a masterpiece of slow-motion engineering. You steered the boat into a stone chamber, closed the heavy oak gates, and waited. You watched the water level rise or fall, inch by agonizing inch, as the paddles were wound up. It was a 10-minute pause in a journey that already took weeks. The life of a boatman's family was a lesson in compacted domesticity. The cabin was a tiny room at the back of the boat, no bigger than a walk-in closet, yet it was polished until it shone. There was a place for everything: the brass spider, for the stove, the lace plates, and the folding bed. The sound of the canal was the soft lap-lap of the bow wave against the reeds and the steady clop-clop of the horse on the towpath. It was a life of gliding stillness, a world where the most significant event was meeting another boat at a narrow bridge or the slow change of the leaves from willow green to autumn gold. Chapter 34. The Precision of the Map Engraver. From the slow, horizontal world of the canal, we move into the cramped, ink-scented workshop of a London map engraver. While the boatman was navigating the landscape, the engraver was shrinking it down onto a copper plate. To be a map engraver in the Victorian era was to be a cartographic monk, a man who spent years of his life staring through a magnifying glass at a piece of metal. Imagine a man sitting at a slanted desk, his world narrowed down to the tip of a burin, a sharp steel tool used for cutting lines into copper. He isn't drawing, he is plowing. Every river, every mountain range, and every tiny village name has to be cut into the metal in reverse. If he wants a line to be darker, he must cut it deeper. If he wants a hachure, the tiny lines that indicate the slope of a hill, he must cut hundreds of them, perfectly parallel, spaced only a hair's breadth apart. The process was so slow that a single map of a county could take a team of engravers 2 years to complete. They lived in a world of mirrored geography, seeing the world backwards so that it would print correctly on the paper. There was no room for error. If the burin slipped while engraving the word London, the entire plate might have to be hammered flat from the back and the area repolished. A process that could take days of silent, frustrated labor. There is a profound, focused peace in the engraver's workshop. It is a world of ink and pressure. The engraver is a man who has decided that accuracy is more important than speed, and that a perfectly rendered coastline is worth more than his eyesight. He lives in a world of static exploration, traveling across continents without ever leaving his stool. As he finishes a plate and rubs the thick, black ink into the grooves for the first proof print, he is seeing the world with a clarity that the people living in it will never know. As we imagine the boatman leaning on his tiller as his horse pulls him through the twilight and the engraver wiping the ink from his stained fingers, we see the beauty of measured progress. One moves through the world, the other captures it. Both require a heart that is content to beat at 4 miles per hour and a mind that is happy to stay within the lines. The horse is led into the stable for the night, the copper plate is wrapped in soft flannel, and the world sinks into a deep, mapped-out slumber. The water is still in the canal, the ink is drying on the paper, and the silence is as vast and detailed as the winding rivers of a forgotten kingdom. Chapter 35. The Tremor Watchers of the Earth's Pulse. Leaving the ink-stained maps of the engraver, we drift away from the surface of the world and look deep beneath our feet. We are entering the quiet, subterranean world of the early seismologists in the late 19th century. While the rest of the world was looking up at the stars or out at the sea, these men were listening to the Earth itself. They were looking for the heartbeat of the planet, but they were doing it at a time when a sensor was just a heavy lead weight hanging from a very long, very still wire. Imagine a man like John Milne stationed in a quiet, stone-walled cellar in Japan or the Isle of Wight. His world was one of enforced stability. To catch a tremor from halfway across the globe, his instruments had to be perfectly insulated from the noise of human life. He lived in a state of static vigilance. He would sit for hours in a room where the air was never allowed to stir, watching a horizontal pendulum, a delicate arm of metal with a tiny needle at the end, resting against a piece of smoked paper on a rotating drum. The sound of the seismograph room was the sound of near silence. There was the faint, rhythmic hiss of the needle scratching against the soot and the slow, clockwork click of the drum turning once every hour. The seismologist lived in a world of microvibrations. He knew the difference between the heavy tread of a horse on the road outside and the deep, low-frequency arrival of a P-wave from an earthquake thousands of miles away. He was a translator of the invisible, a man who spent his life waiting for a wiggle on a line. There is a profound, heavy peace in the cellar of a seismologist. It is the realization that the Earth is never truly still, but that its movements are mostly so slow and so deep that they require a lifetime of quiet to hear. It is a life of patient recording, where the most significant event of the year might be a single, jagged line on a piece of paper that proves the ground beneath us is alive. Chapter 36: The Infinite Loops of the Shetland Lace Knitters. From the heavy, subterranean weights of the seismograph, we float back to the surface, far to the north, to the wind-scoured islands of Shetland. Here, the air is cold and smells of salt and wet wool. We are looking at the lace knitters, women who took the rough, oily wool of the native sheep and turned it into wedding ring shawls, pieces of fabric so fine and so ethereal that an entire 5-foot square of lace could be pulled through a gold wedding ring. Imagine a woman sitting by a peat fire in a small stone croft. Outside, the Atlantic gale is howling, but inside, the only sound is the click-clack of 2 very thin, very long wooden needles. This wasn't the bobbin lace of Flanders. This was knitted lace, a process of intentional holes. To create a shawl, the knitter had to follow a pattern that existed only in her head, names like cat's paw, fern lace, or print of the wave. The life of a Shetland knitter was a masterpiece of productive waiting. They knitted while they walked to the well. They knitted while they watched the sheep. They knitted in the long, dark simmer dim of the northern summer when the sun never quite sets. A single shawl could contain over 1 million individual stitches. If you dropped just one, a single yarn over, or knit 2 together, the entire geometric logic of the lace would collapse. You would have to unpick hours of work in total silence, the wool tinking back into a ball. The most boring and beautiful part was the dressing. Once the shawl was finished, it looked like a crumpled, gray rag. It had to be washed in soft rainwater and then stretched onto a wooden frame with hundreds of tiny pins. As the wool dried, the lace opened up, revealing its intricate, mathematical beauty. It was a reveal that took 12 hours of drying time. The knitter would sit and watch the wool tension itself, turning from a mess into a masterpiece. There is a rhythmic, hypnotic peace in the knitter's hands. It is the belief that a great thing can be built out of a series of very small, identical movements. It is a life lived in loops and rows, a quiet rebellion against the harshness of the islands. As the knitter finally unpins the shawl and feels it float in her hands like a cloud, she isn't thinking of the months of work. She is feeling the lightness of the silence she has woven. As we imagine the seismologist watching his needle and the knitter watching her pins, we see the 2 ways we measure the world, by its vibrations and by its textures. Both require a heart that is happy to be still and a mind that finds joy in the repetitive. The drum of the seismograph is changed for the night, the peat fire in the croft fades to a soft orange glow, and the world sinks into a deep, rhythmic slumber. The earth is steady, the wool is soft, and the silence is as vast and intricate as 1 million hand-knit stitches. Chapter 37: The Slow-Motion Rivers of the Glacier Researchers. Leaving the delicate wool of the Shetland Isles, we drift toward the high, crystalline silence of the Alps in the mid-19th century. We are looking at the early glaciologists, men like Louis Agassiz, who decided that the best way to understand the history of the Earth was to stand on a giant block of ice and wait for it to move. To study a glacier is to enter a world where speed is measured in inches per year. These researchers would trek up to the Hotel de Nucatelois, which wasn't a hotel at all, but a cramped, damp shelter built under a massive boulder on the Ar Glacier. Their life was a masterpiece of frigid observation. They would hammer a line of wooden stakes into the ice in a perfectly straight row, and then they would wait. They would return a year later to find that the stakes had moved into a gentle curve, proving that the glacier was not a static block, but a viscous, frozen river. The sound of the glacier was the sound of geological digestion, the occasional sharp crack of a new crevasse opening, or the constant, low-frequency drip-drip of meltwater echoing in the blue depths of an ice cave. The researchers lived in a world of thermal patience. They spent their days measuring the temperature of the ice at different depths and their nights huddled around a small spirit stove, recording their findings in notebooks that became damp and warped from the constant humidity. It was a life of cold focus, a long, slow study of a landscape that was moving just fast enough to be alive, but slow enough to be eternal. Chapter 38. The Mirror Soul of the Japanese Sword Polisher. From the white expanses of the Alps, we move into the small, water-splashed workshop of a togishi, or Japanese sword polisher. While the swordsmith creates the blade with fire and hammer, the polisher reveals its soul with nothing but stone and water. This is perhaps the most quietly intense profession in history. Imagine a man sitting on a low stool, his world narrowed down to a 13-inch piece of steel and a series of water stones of increasing fineness. The process of polishing a single katana can take over 100 hours of continuous, rhythmic labor. The polisher doesn't just rub the metal, he communicates with it. He starts with coarse stones to shape the blade and gradually moves to stones so fine they feel like smooth silk to the touch. The sound of the workshop is the shuck of steel on wet stone. The polisher uses finger stones, tiny, paper-thin slivers of stone backed with lacquered paper, to polish the hamon, the undulating temper line of the blade. He must apply exactly the same pressure with every stroke. If his mind wanders, if he thinks about his dinner or the weather, the pressure will change and the clarity of the steel will be lost. He lives in a state of monastic concentration, his eyes fixed on the reflections in the metal until the blade becomes a mirror that shows not just his face, but the very grain of the folded steel. There is a profound, watery peace in the togishi's work. It is the belief that beauty is already there, hidden beneath the surface, and that the only way to find it is through the slow, repetitive application of patience. As the polisher finally wipes the blade with a soft silk cloth and applies a thin layer of clove oil, he is looking at a perfection that took a week of silence to achieve. As we imagine the researcher measuring his stakes in the ice and the polisher feeling the grain of the steel, we see the beauty of subtlety. One observes the movement of a mountain, the other observes the movement of a molecule. Both require a heart that is happy to be quiet and a mind that finds joy in the tiniest details. The sun sets over the peaks of the Alps, the water in the polisher's basin becomes still, and the world sinks into a deep, reflective slumber. The glacier is moving, the steel is shining, and the silence is as clear and cold as a mountain stream.